And those are young adult novels, correct?
Yes, young adult novels. Adults can read them too.
All right, and the next speaker is Lou Corsino. Lou is a sociologist who received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts and grew up in the Chicago suburb of Chicago Heights, as did Dominic. He has authored The Neighborhood Outfit, Organized Crime in Chicago Heights. Currently, his focus is the Italian immigrant experience. Lou?
Thank you. I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. I don't know how long this will go, so what I'd like to do is not talk about the book that's listed here, because I'd rather talk about the current research that I'm doing, and to the extent possible, maybe get your response to it. So I'm going to try to parse my 15 minutes into presenting a thesis, but also maybe getting some response from you with respect to the thesis. Like I said, the study that I'm working on now grew out of this book on organized crime. And one of the questions I asked at this particular time, why did Italians dominate organized crime, participate, for nearly 100 years in Chicago, in the nation, and in the Chicago Heights? It led me, that question led me to focus upon immigration. That looking at this book led me to focus upon immigration. That organized crime, in my view, was an adaptation to the struggles that Italians faced in terms of dealing with the immigration experiences. It was, for better or worse, and we can argue that for better or worse, a ladder of mobility for Italians. Organized crime was a step up the ladder of mobility for Italians, especially Southern Italians, who were especially discriminated against. But then as I was doing the research, I wondered why that is organized crime, was not pursued by many other Italians. That given the dire circumstances that many Italians faced at the turn of the last century, even past that, why did not the vast majority of Italians use organized crime or some sort of non-traditional sort of routes in terms of making the way into American society? Given the work, Italians, if you look at the history of Italians, they worked in horrific work situations. The railroad gangs out west, the factories were horrible places to work and deplorable places to work, along with low pay. There was certainly a good deal of cultural sort of stereotypes and negativity towards Italians that Italians had to deal with. The neighborhoods that Italians grew up in, as much as we want to try to look at the neighborhoods in a more positive light, the neighborhoods are pretty awful sort of places in a sort of comparative sense. I mean, there was a great deal of violence in the neighborhood. They lived in tenements, many people lived in tenements. The disease, childhood disease, was very high in these sort of Italian sort of neighborhoods. So, I'm trying to think about why didn't Italians either pursue the non-traditional routes to success, either through labor organizing or even organized crime? And the answer I came up with was not so surprisingly, was hope. The answer I came up with was hope. Italians, like other immigrant groups, pushed forward, given the dire circumstances, given the problems. The Italians pushed forward because they had hope for a better life, or they had hope for a better life for their children. But here, I'm a sociologist, so here I take a dark turn, okay? And that I asked, the question I ask, if I suggest that hope is sort of the solution to some of the dire circumstances, I ask, where did this hope come from? If you look at the research on the Mezzogiorno, if you look at Italy during the last half a century, that's not an area that produces a lot of hope. I mean, much of the research, much of the ethnography about that says it's a period in which it was a hopeless sort of period. The amoral familialism, the melancholy that experienced, the pessimism that sort of characterized, the provincialism that characterized many Italian sort of cultures and the like. It was not an area that was brimming with hope if you look at that particular sort of way. Because of that, and here's the thesis, because of that, I argue that hope, and I argue that hope was instilled in the Italian immigrants by the dominant status groups in American society. That it was instilled and encouraged by these dominant groups in American society as a way of disciplining and controlling these people who were seen as threats to the dominant power culture of the groups that were already here. The Italians, with their strange cultures, as we've talked about today, with their strange foods, with their strange religious practices we all probably identify with their love of wine, and because they came in such massive numbers, as we talked about earlier, that these Italians were seen as aliens. Many Italians were seen as aliens, and aliens from a foreign and negative place. There were a number of attempts, if you look at the history of Italian immigration to America, there were a number of attempts to control and discipline these Italians, these alien groups. There were laws against the culture. So many people argue prohibition was really a law against particular ethnic groups who engaged in some form of liquor as a part of their culture. There were certainly immigration quotas that we've talked about today that were instituted to restrict the number of aliens that were coming into the country. There was an attempt to criminalize the most nefarious sort of Italians. The Sacco and Vanzetti is just one example of this. But if you look through the history, there was an attempt to sort of control Italians, the immigrant Italians, in terms of making them criminals. And there were certainly lynchings, and there were other sort of experiences. So there were a number of ways, I think, that the dominant groups in society, in a benign way, I don't think they got behind doors and said, let's do this to Italians. I mean, in some ways they tried to help Italians acclimate to American society, but the ways in which they did that, I think in some ways were unintended, but also very destructive for the Italian sort of experience. One of the ways, outside of the ways I just talked about in terms of laws and quotas, one of the ways to control and discipline Italians was to instill hope, because hope was a far more effective mechanism for social control of Italians. So if you get these strangers, if you get these aliens to believe in hope, if you get these strangers to believe in the American dream, then you can control them from within. You can control them more effectively from within. And my research, therefore, as I'm going forward, my research is on Chicago Heights. My research is on Chicago Heights in attempts to show how hope itself was instilled over the immigrant experience in this particular sort of manner. So I look, for example, at the recruitment of Italians from southern Italy at the turn of the last century. Steamship agents went over to Italy and recruited them with the promises of the streets are paved with gold. In fact, it became so difficult that the Italian legislature had instituted laws in terms of saying what the steamship agents could say and how they could produce flyers in terms of not promising too much. You had to be very careful in terms of what steamship agents, they violated it, but you had to be very careful in terms of what you said according to the Italian laws. If you look at the terrible experiences of Italians crossing the Atlantic, some people argue, though again not intentionally, the very experience of crossing the Atlantic in the steerage sort of conditions sort of was one of despair, sort of prepped the Italians to accept hope when they came. If you look at the actual experiences in the processing of Italians at Ellis Island that we heard again today, Ellis Island was, the nickname for Ellis Island was?
The Golden Door.
The Golden Door, also the island of hope and the island of despair. And it's sort of, and just looking at, somebody made a presentation today, the Statue of Liberty, that you could even argue that the Statue of Liberty was in a way in which the idea of hope, the Statue of Liberty stands, is very erect. And when they looked at, when they were processing people at Ellis Island, one of the things that they looked at, because they couldn't figure out what was in people's heads, the temperament, they looked at how people acted, whether they were stooping, whether they walked slowly, and the clothes they wore, as a way of determining in some ways whether they were, whether they wanted to admit them into the particular sort of country. So even the behaviors of the processing behaviors themselves was a way of starting instilling this idea of what an American looked like. And certainly when the immigrants made it to America, after passing to Ellis Island, the whole Americanization processes in terms of changing our names, not speaking Italian, was a way in which Italians learned early on that if you're going to become American, you had to hope and adopt a sort of American sort of dream that was laid out for them. And so I think in some ways, again, we could challenge this. I think in some ways, I was talking to a friend one time, and they said, I was telling them this thesis, and they said, basically you're saying that hope sucks. And I said, well, not really, but hope was used in a particular way to sort of control people in terms of what they thought, in terms of how they felt, and in terms of how they acted. I mean, I can't do this. If I would do this, and if I would do this, historically, that would be seen as being non-American. So, you know, classes in which people taught to even behave in particular ways to exhibit the hope that was accepted in American society. Okay, hope that was appropriate in American society. Now, it didn't. My argument here is it didn't take for all. There were some immigrants who came to America that became ensconced in the Italian culture and were never really accepted hope, and they never really were a part of the American society. They were always aliens. My grandmother lived 70-something years in America, and I could never say she was hopeful. I mean, she existed and did all these wonderful sort of things, but I don't think she ever adopted the American dream of mobility and success and the like. She was always an alien. She lived 70 years and died as an alien in American culture. She wasn't an American in the classic sense of the term. There were other people who consciously rejected the American idea of hope, who engaged in labor organizing and tried to present a different conception of hope in terms of some of the socialist organizations, the IWW and the like. In the end, I think, as we sit here today, I think most of us did accept that. Our parents did, or somewhere along the line. Most of us accepted, and that was a good bargain too, because by accepting the American dream, the American deal of hope, it was a bargain for us. It was a good choice that our parents made, or some of us made, to sort of move ahead in American society in terms of the immigrant experiences. But the question I leave you with, and I don't know where I'm at, the question I leave you with is that while it was not a bad bargain to accept hope, the idea that mobility, the idea that you should, you know, speak English, the idea that you should do all the things that defined you as American, that was a good choice. But in the process, I guess, what did we give up? Did we give up a certain sort of cultural legacy and what it meant to be Italian? Could we have, if given the choice, adjusted to America, but adjusted to America more on Italian terms rather than non-American sort of terms? And what I hear today, and what Dominic does with, Dominic's a homeboy from Chicago Heights, what Dominic does here with the Casa Italia is to sort of bring back that sort of legacy in some ways, is to reinvigorate the good parts about what it means to be Italian and to refigure what does it mean to be hopeful from an Italian and an American sort of perspective. And I think the conversations we've had today, I think, do that very sort of thing. They regenerate idea of what it means to be American, but also Italian. And so that's some of the research I'm trying to present going forward. I'd be happy to have critiques or challenges or added insights.
Yeah, Lou, thanks. I wonder if there was more than one kind of hope. In other words, I'm thinking of the Calabrian immigrants 120 years ago. At the very least, they had hoped they were going to make money. At the very least. How many said, boy, I hope I can make it, I hope I can be an American, I hope I can, maybe not as many. Then as time went on, that probably changed. And I think you're talking about, like, what you're talking about, Mo, is like the progressive era and sort of the Americanization that happened. Some of it very paternalistically, but probably maybe with good motives, right? You know, I'm trying to get people.
Yeah,
and in my own presentation, a lot of those men, none of those that I talked about today, but they were in development battalions in the Army because they couldn't speak English and they couldn't read. And the progressive era Army, rather than just discharge them back out, taught them Americanization classes, English, citizenship, whatever, and all different languages, but I'm talking about Italian. So that's sort of a different kind of hope, maybe. And then you have the men who enlisted intentionally in the Army even before World War I. That speaks of at least some sort of Americanization or adaptation. So
who gets to control the hope? And hope is essential, but who gets, because it's about something in the future, about something that's uncertain, because you don't know, who gets to control it? And I think many of the Italians who came earlier on were interested in survival.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it was, they were interested in just sort of making it. And many of the women who came here wasn't even a question. They weren't hopeful. They were told to come here.
I understand what you said about your grandmother, probably kind of saying.
Yeah. I got 1 minute. I got 1 minute to go. So you got 1 minute.
Are you saying that there was a conspiracy of hope? That there's someone in the background saying we got to instill hope in these folks, or it is American culture that did it, and the American school system?
Well, there's certain you can make an argument for a conspiracy if you look at the other things in which the dominant groups did to sort of restrict the number of Italians that were here in terms of quotas, that they didn't want these aliens here. If you ask me if there was a conspiracy in terms of they were sitting in a room sort of figuring it out, no. I think they had benign, good reasons to do this. The unintended consequences was that they created Italians and other immigrant groups in their sort of image. And I think that's happening today with other groups, and we look at other sort of immigrant sort of experiences today.
Compare it with Canada?
Compare. You're asking me, or is you?
Or, I mean, is that part of the analysis here to compare? Canada did a better job of allowing people to keep their culture while integrating somewhat.
Well, I'd like to answer that, but my time is out.
That's right.